All right, thank you so much. For our next speaker today, we're very, very lucky to have with us Johan Eisenbrand. Johan is very dear to the design community. He's got such a vast, incredible point of view about design, but also a generosity that makes sure that it's protected. So we're very, very grateful for his point of view. Charles Eames once called Alexander Gerard the Florentine magpie, referencing his Italian upbringing as well as his tendency to acquire things. Johan will talk next about how Italy influenced Gerard's designs. His talk is entitled Renaissance Man, on the Italian roots of Gerard's design. Johan is the chief curator of the Vitra Design Museum and the curator of the exhibition now on view here until next Sunday. So come as many times as you can. A Designer's Universe. He is also the co-editor of the comprehensive publication, The Atlas of Furniture Design, published by the Vitra Design Museum, and it will be out November 1st. We all have a little bit of there's a printout in our brochure, so get to typing, get that ordered right away. It's going to be an important book. So please welcome Johan.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation, which really presented a wonderful occasion to dig deeper into Gerard's relationship with Italy. Done a few retrospectives on designers and architects, and always found it particularly interesting to look at the early stages of their careers, the beginnings when things were still in flux, and their interests and approaches were just about to emerge or to evolve, and were not really determined yet. So in that sense, this talk presented a wonderful occasion to look into that. Also, actually, we had originally, for the exhibition catalog to Alexander Gerard, Designer's Universe, we had commissioned an essay on Alexander Gerard's relation to Italy, and for different reasons, this essay didn't plot out. It couldn't be realized and couldn't be included in the book. So, yeah, here we are now, finally doing this, sort of the lost chapter of the catalog. Also, in terms of the archival situation, there was the lucky coincidence that when I came here for the opening in the spring, I met with Margolis and Moss, the rare and second-hand bookstore, and we were able to make a new acquisition for our Gerard archive, which included quite a few interesting documents related to this early family history and his early history. Also this spring, I had the wonderful opportunity to visit Dania Gerard, who is the niece of Alexander. She's the adopted daughter of his brother Giancarlo, and she lives in Florence still and keeping also an archive, and she gave me a peek view of the archive she's keeping there. So this talk will actually also be an opportunity to speak a bit about the relationship of the brothers Giancarlo, because of course you also here in the Gerard wing are having some pieces by Giancarlo, and he was also related to Herman Miller in different ways. So shed some light on that relation. So this is actually coming from the archive of Dania. It shows the Gerard family, his father, Carlo Matteo, who was of French-Italian descent, and his mother, Leslie, who hailed from Boston. So there was already this cosmopolitan connection. Gerard himself was born in 1907 in New York, but his parents and him moved back to Florence in 1909, where he then grew up. Also with a sister, Leslie, born in 1910, also here on the picture, and his brother, Giancarlo, later also called Tunzi or Jinx, was born in 1917, hence 10 years younger, so quite an age gap there between the two. Alexander Gerard's grandfather on the father's side, so the father of Carlo Matteo Gerard, had a hotel in Florence, a pension, called Pensione Gerard, fittingly. He was married to Leopoldina Augustina, and they ran this pension together, where once the author André Gide stayed in the 1890s, which is known from letters that he sent from the Pensione Gerard, and also because he mentions it in one of his novels, The School for Wives, that was published in 1929. Gide was in Florence at the time to visit the Gabinetto Scientifico Letterario Vieusseux, which was kind of a reading room and a circulating library to offer an exchange between the Florentines and general European literature, so kind of a humanist venture and meeting place. Girard's father, Carlo Matteo, and the mother, they met because his father was actually collaborating with Leslie Girard's father. And they had a business together, Cutler and Girard, that was based in Florence, but also had a branch in New York, and was a very successful. They were antique dealers, but also creating furniture. We see two ads here in which they speak about in which they mention their different branches. And also the presentations at different world expositions. So they were exhibiting in Paris in 1900 at the World Exhibition, in Turin in 1902, St. Louis 1904, it was the time of the world exhibitions, obviously, and in Brussels 1910. So this way of not only creating design pieces, furniture, but also trading with it and displaying it was something that was already running in the family, so to speak. And Girard would later have his own first exhibition at the World Exhibition in Barcelona in 1929, which is the one for which Mies van der Rohe created the famous Barcelona Pavilion that Girard also visited and would later mention that that was one of his favorite presentations. Interestingly, in the Girard archive that we keep at the museum, there are a number of documents that relate to the Freemasons. My understanding is that either his grandfather on the mother's side and or his father were members of the Freemasons. The family was also involved in the American Red Cross. The American Red Cross had taken a stronghold in Italy in the wake of or during World War II, so with humanitarian help. So there was a strong community there in which Carlo Matteo Girard was involved. As part of this sort of humanitarian engagement, they were also involved in the donation of a garden or park in Florence called the Nidiaci Gardens that were given to the community as sort of an open space for children to play and for leisure time. And this has been recently up on the web because apparently this part of the city was to be developed and built on, and the neighborhood was demonstrating against it. And in the process of this, they looked into the history of these gardens, and then actually came also upon the family Girard and their involvement in this. Also part of this donation of the Nidiaci Garden was one Colonel Edward Bartlett, I have no idea if there's a relation, who was a commissioner of the American Red Cross in Italy at the time. And in an article that speaks about these Nidiaci Gardens and this donation and the whole history of it, there's also mentioned that in 1925 in Florence, there was a sort of well, what would you call that? Like a pogrom by the fascists that were rising in Italy at the time. And in that article, there's even mentioned that it was called the Notte di San Bartolomeo in the October 1925, and that the workshops of Cutler Girard were ransacked then because this sort of activities of the fascists were also against Freemasons. This is the two brothers, Alexander and Giancarlo. This is also coming from Dania Girard's archive. In June 1936, I assume it's in the garden of La Lucciola. So Alexander was around 29 and Giancarlo around 19 at the time. And it may have been one of the first visits of Alexander after he moved to New York. That's something I'll get to a bit later. So we're seeing here, I'd also been showing that in the spring, 2 images of La Lucciola. I think it was the 3rd or 4th address they had in Florence. A former house they were staying in was Il Poderino. Here in La Lucciola, they moved in 1923, and they kept the house until 1960. So it was a place that where Girard would again and again return to. And the mother, Leslie, didn't die until 1975, so Italy was, always a place to return to. And it was also a house where they would, once Girard and his family lived in the US, would bring friends from the US too. The Eames came there, Eero Saarinen, Neiman Marcus, the Millers, they would all visit. For Alexander and Giancarlo, this wonderful estate with a nice little park must also have been a wonderful playground. Below we see 2 maps. The one on the left has been drawn up by Alexander, and the one on the right has been drawn up by Giancarlo. And Dania told me about this map that he kind of divided the garden of La Lucciola into different parts: the Campo della Lucciola, the garden, and then the first and 4th floor and the ground floor of the house. And that they imagined on this campus and in the house there to be a palace, international stores, a cinema, a telephone house. And then meeting important characters, sirs and ladies and lords, all imaginary. So this was sort of the physical base for this Republic of Five that I also mentioned in a minute. It seems that they had really a very dear, close relationship, the siblings among each other. Here in the archive of the Folk Art Museum of International Folk Art, the museum is keeping a number of children's books that Alexander created for Giancarlo. I assume maybe also at a time when he went to boarding school, at around age 10, he was sent to a boarding school in the UK, the Bedford Modern School, hence was far away from the family and his siblings, and may have sent these children's books back to Florence. In the archive in Florence, there's also some children's books that Giancarlo created. So they had this exchange going on, this literary exchange, so to speak. On the upper right-hand side, you see Humpty Dumpty, a very a wonderful English children's song illustrated in a book. The Republic of Five, I think, really grew out of this, them imagining another world in Florence, but then also when being separated, an imaginary universe with maps, many different secret languages, vocabulary books, passports, stamps, coins, the currency, a bit of which you see in the exhibition. This is a magazine that Alexander drew up. And it was supposed to be the first magazine of the Republic of Five and to become a continuous magazine. This is the only issue, the first we found. But it was to be a monthly, actually, very ambitious. And in the news section, it mentions that 2 members of the Republic of Five are coming to London in 1925, where Alexander Girard at the time had started to study architecture at the Architectural Association. It also invites contributions from other family members. From early on, the family traveled a lot, also with the children, so they're really very cosmopolitan at a young age. And they also explored the region around Florence, so also undertook travels in Tuscany. These are some of the drawings that have just surfaced recently. So there's a drawing of all Tuscany. There's a drawing on the upper right of the towers of San Gimignano from 1920. So Alexander Girard was only 13 when he drew this. I think that the wellhead on the left-hand side may actually have been in the garden of La Lucciola. I'm not totally sure. And the one on the bottom right says, drawn on the trip to Siena. And that was also in 1920. So it was one sketchbook with these early drawings already showing how gifted he was. In the exhibition, you can see this drawing here of Florence that was done when Alexander was studying architecture at the AA. It's a number of Renaissance buildings, mainly by Brunelleschi, that are assembled here on this drawing like a stage set. In the background, of course, you have the Duomo by Brunelleschi. Then you have the Palazzo della Parte Guelfa, from left to right. So then Horseman Ferdinando on Piazza Santissima Annunziata by Giovanni da Bologna, the Pazzi Chapel, again by Brunelleschi, and then the Ospedale degli Innocenti, also by Brunelleschi. And you can, on the upper right, you can see an M13. That was his grade, and I think it went to 13 or 14 at the most. So he got a good grade on that. So you see an interest here, and of course that was part of the curriculum, looking into the Renaissance architecture, but also into ancient Greece and Rome. So still very much of a Beaux-Arts education he was enjoying there at the Architectural Association. This particular drawing may also have been inspired by other Renaissance paintings, such as this Capriccio Palladiano by Canaletto, an oil painting that was executed in 1756 to 59, where Canaletto is bringing together different Venetian buildings from Palladio on one side. So he's also merging real buildings together in a way they weren't to be seen, to create an imaginary new place. And the Museum of Folk Art, Laura has kindly shown me that last time I was here, has also acquired a very interesting inventory of the books that Alexandre Gérard owned up until the early 1930s. And yesterday there was this mention of lists and lists being a constant in his work and in his sort of archival documentation. This is another one, very beautiful, from A to Z, all the books he owned at that time and where he bought them, all noted. And among these books is, for instance, Architettura della Rinascenza da Brunelleschi a Michelangelo from Dagobert Frey from 1924, or Artists of the Italian Renaissance by Emma Lewis Seeley from 1907, or also a book on Brunelleschi by Leda Scott that he bought in London in 1926. So it was just around the time when he made that drawing, so maybe even in preparation of that. He was also interested in the Italian vernacular, one might say, so the architecture that's maybe usually overseen or not noticed. In 1929, he was given a travel fellowship from the AA, and I think he used that to travel through Italy with a fellow student to look at wellheads in Italy. And this article here was published in the student magazine of the AA. We actually had quite a few articles in that magazine, and I really liked the introduction. He writes, the wellhead soon becomes a familiar object to the traveler in Italy. In cloister, in palace court, in market square, the well plays an important yet unassuming part. Who has not left the tedious round of sightseeing to lean for a few moments of respite, peering down into the cold and dark pool of water, or running his fingers over the smooth travertine moldings? This was a piece he published with a fellow student named John Cruikshank Rose, who later became an archaeologist who was to work in Egypt, Iran, and the West Indies, and was also a good friend of Agatha Christie. Alexander also did a few other wood carvings that were published in this student magazine, and they also did an article, for instance, on the wooden churches of Russia. So you can already see that sort of the scope of interest is already broadening. It was also broadening beyond architecture. This is a page from a photo album that was also part of this recent acquisition from 1931, showing Florence costumes. Don't know who the people are. Maybe Marshall has an idea who that could be. So there's already this interest in other parts of tradition and creation. And yesterday there was mention of these boxes, and they were stacked here when Charlene was speaking, in which he kept all his things. And there's another type of boxes, smaller, in which documents and photos and slides were kept, and they were often wrapped into these beautiful, like marbleized papers that also came from, many of which came from Florence. There was also this interest in paper, in crafting paper. The first, so besides this presentation that he had in Barcelona of some actually also furniture pieces in 1929, the first really interior design project that Alexandre Gérard had was an apartment for Giorgio Uccelli that he designed in 1930, and it included furnishings for a bedroom, a living room, and a dining room with an armoire, a vanity, ceiling lamp, and a wrought iron faceplate for the fireplace in the living room, showing a landscape. This was in the Palazzo Uccelli that had been built in 1870 by the father of Giorgio Uccelli. Giorgio Uccelli, an interesting figure in the Florentine society. He was raised in a literary family that owned farms in Tuscany. He had received a humanist education, which culminated in a Doctor of Law degree from the University of Pisa. He had married a French heiress and had 2 sons, and had started a manufacturing business that produced shatterproof glass for train windows. By that's the sort of sad part of the story, 1937, so this was a Jewish family, and they had to leave Italy, also because of the rise of fascism, because their sons couldn't attend the school in Italy anymore, and he was just deprived of his right to operate his business. So he left and emigrated to New York, actually briefly after Alexandre Gérard himself had emigrated for other reasons. And later, as I found out after the war, he started collecting Aldine. The Aldine press was a press, also a Renaissance press, that was founded by Aldus Manutius in Venice in 1494, and then existed for about 100 years. And these books are cherished for their printing quality and typographic quality and graphic design. And and this Giorgio Uccelli, for whom Alexander had worked in 1930, brought together this wonderful collection of books that are today at the University of Texas at the Harry Ransom Humanities Research Center. That gave me some of this information on Uccelli, who in New York became a very successful stockbroker. That's how he could buy these books, I guess. Gérard, again, traveled a lot around this time, late 1920s, early 1930s. He worked for an architect in Paris for a short while, one John W. Chandler, who seems to have come from California and also moved to France during the time of the First World War. Gérard also traveled to Budapest, to Vienna, and then up north to Hamburg, Copenhagen, and Stockholm, and then spent a year in Stockholm to work for the Nordiska company, a very modern company making furniture. We're not sure what his duties were there. In the archive, there are a few advertisings for wallpapers for the Salubra company, for which Le Corbusier also worked. So he may have designed a few wallpapers there. This is him. So again, there's a few books from this photo album that show him on all these different places, also skiing in Davos. This is him in Rome on the upper right-hand side. That's him, and the other images are images of friends. This is where he goes after he comes back from Stockholm, and he works for an engineer, Ugo Giovanozzi, who was also involved in the American Red Cross, so there may have been a connection there through the Red Cross as well. Between 1938 and 1940, so later, Giovannozzi would become responsible for the restoration of Palazzo Strozzi in Florence, and at the time in the early 1930s, he was commissioned for the restoration of private residences, and Gérard helped him in Rome with the restoration of some of these residences. So that was sort of his the practical job, and he also attended the Scuola Reale di Architettura in Rome, and was then given the Italian diploma of architecture. So he had his English diploma, but then also the Italian one. And in his collection, as we can see in that register, he also owned a book on the work of Giovannozzi. As an architect, he also had his own studio that was on the upper floor of La Lucciola that he installed, I think, around 1930 as well. We see two images here that were later published for 45 in Arts and Industry, a magazine, and that actually positions the studio in New York, curiously. And on the right-hand side is one of those woodcuts that he had published in a student magazine at the AA. Well, I'm coming to Giancarlo now, because he took over this studio, as I found out now. This is also a photo from the niece from Dania. And Giancarlo, again, 10 years younger, he was sent, he also first self-taught at home at La Lucciola, but then also sent to a boarding school in the UK, Paxton Park in Cambridge. That was the early 30s, and it seems that he just came back from boarding school at the age 16 or 17 before Sandro then left to the US. Jings then studied at the Accademia Belle Arti in Florence, and during World War II went to Switzerland, and then also worked for the Red Cross in Geneva. And here, on the upper floor of La Lucciola, using the former studio of his brother, he established himself as a commercial graphic artist. He created advertisements for a watch company called Europa, advertisings for a wine and liquor company called Motzig in Basel, so actually really close to where we are with our museum, for a linoleum manufacturers, but also labels and book jackets, and actually some logos for companies as well. This is a brochure. It doesn't have a date. I assume that it was published in the early 1950s by an agency called ITAM. I haven't found anything on it. It was based in Milan, and it may have been sort of a loose like institution connecting graphic designers. Interestingly, it was published in the English language, so it was really directed to an international audience, and it introduces Jings, John C. Girard, as, quote, a freelance of the truest cosmopolitan outlook and spirit. Having mastered 3 languages, his 7 years of experience of graphic design has carried him from Italy to England, then to France and Switzerland, now back to Italy. This is also one of the works he's done for Esso. Quite a bit of work for Esso, and I thought it was interesting because already here you see also this narrative quality, this sort of storytelling that's also in the work of such a strong hold in the work of Alexander Girard. So jumping back a bit in time and back to Alexander Girard, who decides to move to New York in 1932. This is a drawing you can also see in the exhibition, and I just think it's interesting because you can, by this drawing here, you can probably made from the window of one of his first places where we were staying in New York in 1935. You can see Italy is still on his mind. There's a small Italian flag here next to the bigger US flag. In New York, he establishes himself as an interior designer, working for restaurants on the one hand, but also for wealthy private clients, designing their apartments. This is a drawing that he made for a restaurant called Café Trouville, of which you see a few artifacts in the exhibition. He really created the complete interior, and it was an early, really, one could say, corporate design, a predecessor to the works La Fonda or L'Étoile, where he has one theme, which is sort of the international cafe that he then uses for the design of the whole cafe. And he uses the word cheers in many different languages, reappearing then on tabletops and on glasses that he, of course, also designed. And for these tabletops, he was working with a company called Alpini Terrazzi. So I think it may have been Italian immigrants also in New York that he was artisans that he was working with there. This particular drawing here was not executed, but it's really interesting because it's showing a mural with aerial views of Stockholm, Moscow, and Venice. And this here is two images, not great images, I'm sorry, but from the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence, built around 1300, with frescoes by Giorgio Vasari that were executed, painted in 1565, showing the cities of the Austrian Habsburg monarchy, among them Graz, Innsbruck, Linz, Vienna, Freiburg, also close to us, and Constance. So apparently there was an inspiration here from Renaissance frescoes that he then transmitted or proposed to transmit to a New York restaurant. These murals that sort of open a window into another world and show kind of a fantasy world behind the walls were a constant feature in some of his early designs. On the top left, we see a mural depicting Italianate architectural scenes. You have to imagine them in pink, white, and shades of red. Restaurant Passy, that was in 1934. This was actually executed. And then also murals that he created for his own apartment in New York in 1935. So really architectural fantasies that are merging the interior with an imagined exterior. And much later, Gérard would speak about the interior as a stage with moving props. So there was really a close connection to the idea of the theater. And this technique called the trompe d'oeil was something that really emerged as a technique in the Renaissance time due to progress in optical sciences, and then also in perspective drawing. So again, there's a connection there. And I keep thinking also of Giorgio de Chirico, who actually visited La Lucciola in 1941 with Primo Conti, a futurist painter. His metaphysical landscapes that I assume Alexander Gérard must also have known. And other references, these are postcards. He had a very large postcard collection of places he'd been to, or maybe also not have been to. This is a hotel in Venice, and on the right-hand side from the National Museum in Rome, reliefs from ancient Roman times that also show a striking similarity to some of those murals that he created. Another discovery in the archive were these drawings of two figures completely built out of furniture. This was at a time when he created his own furniture portfolio, working as an interior designer in New York. And below are etchings by Nicolas de Larmessin II. In the second half of the 17th century, this Frenchman created a series of 97 etchings called the Costumes Grotesques et Métiers, depicting the costumes of different trades in a sort of absurd or funny way. On the right-hand side, we see a cheesemonger, and on the left-hand side, a carpenter. So I'm sure that Alexander Gérard knew these and created these two follies on top in this spirit. In his early days in New York, he also seems to have applied to become a stage set designer. He was a great fan of theater, and we have quite a few from that time. Even he kept programs of theater visits, and he created 3 stage set drawings for Radio City Music Hall in 1933. One of them being this nativity scene in a kind of modernized Renaissance setting. Another one is on the top left in a much more modernized style. This is kind of a footnote, but I've been intrigued by some of the parallels between Fortunato Dippo, one of the founders of Futurism, also hailed from Italy, of course, and who just a bit before Gérard went to New York from 28 to 1930, and curiously also tried to become a stage set designer and created this on the right. He proposed a play called The New Babylon on the city of New York that was never realized. And below, so this is completely just I'm just making this up, but looking at the work of Fortunato Dippo, but his archive is held at the Mart in Rovereto, and on the right-hand side, this is a drawing that Dippo made to learn English. So he drew this stanza, this room, and noting what the English words are. And on the left-hand side is a drawing by Alexandre Gérard, where he also drew up this room to learn the English word, what is the ceiling, what is the bed, and so on. Probably, I assume, when he went to Bedford Modern School, so a bit earlier. I just thought it was a curious coincidence. In 1935, in New York, Alexander received his first really big architectural commission from the Leonardo da Vinci Art School, a new building for this art school. Again, here, Leonardo, the Renaissance man, giving the name to the school. It was an art school founded in New York City in 1923. It existed until 1942 on the Lower East Side, and it offered education mainly to poor immigrants, so an art education. And it was at the time the only school to still offer the art of fresco painting. The director was the sculptor and poet Onorio Ruotolo, who was nicknamed the Rodin of Little Italy. And the most famous student of the school was Isamu Noguchi. The school moved in 1934 up to 34th Street, and I assume that in the context of this move, they were considering a new building and asked Alexander here on the photo on the right in tuxedo to design this new building, and he created these wonderful drawings for it, even created a model which was then photographed. But unfortunately, the building was never realized. I assume they were just lacking the funds eventually. But that was really the biggest commission he had. Well, as we know, and as we heard in Amy's wonderful talk, he then moved on to Michigan with Susan, his wife, whom he had just married in 1936. And in 1937, they moved to Grosse Pointe, or first to Detroit, actually, where Gérard is working for an interior design firm, Thomas A. Aisling, where his father had helped him to get his job there. He doesn't really like it because it's too conventional. And then soon starts to work in many different fields for the automobile industry, also designing canteens for them or offices, and then opens his own gallery in Grosse Pointe in 1945. And here, this is his first, an example of his early letterhead, where again we see reference to these earlier murals. And on the upper right-hand side, that's from a publication of his first apartment in Detroit. That was published in 1947 in Detroit, in Domus magazine, sorry. So you see that also in terms of getting published, the connections to Italy are still valid. And below is one of the many one of the invitations to the many exhibitions that he staged at his gallery in Grosse Pointe, and this one was featuring Italian handicrafts. I'm really focusing on these, or trying to focus on these Italian connections here. There was, of course, much more happening at the time, and it was really, this move to Michigan was also his move to modernism in a way. That's where he was really exposed to modern design a lot. Met the Eames, met Eero Saarinen, met all the people studying at Cranbrook. And then, of course, staged this important exhibition for modern living at the Detroit Institute of Arts in '49, for which he decides not to do the mural himself, but to invite the great Saul Steinberg to execute a mural as one part of this fantastic and groundbreaking exhibition. Really like this drawing here. This was also part of the recent acquisition. We had some materials on this For Modern Living exhibition, and here we can see that. Of course, all the photos of this exhibition now are just black and white, and here we can see that some parts of the mural were actually executed in color. This is one of the things that Saul was sending to Alexander. And again, there's an Italian connection because Saul Steinberg, he hailed from Romania, but he studied architecture at the Politecnico in Milan in the early 1930s, so just around the time when Girard left to the US. And in their letters, they write to each other as Caro Sandro and Caro Saul. The last mural that was really executed in the style that he had come up with in the 1930s was the one that Amy actually just mentioned in her talk for the exhibition, Miller exhibition, Space for an Open Mind, at the Grand Rapids Furniture Museum in '51, and she was showing us photos of the executed mural. So this was a drawing in felt pen. Before that, and Todd and I were speaking yesterday that going through the archive, you both of us, we were interested in process and how he would sketch things, but this is a sketch. It's already the finished thing. It seems as if he had it all in his mind already, and he drew it up, and then he went to the place, and then he executed it himself. So yeah, quite amazing. And you see that it's skewed there because it was this attic, so that's already taken into account here. I won't speak about the other murals he did because that will be dealt with later today. But so I think we see a clear succession here, and then with the later murals, there's really a move to more abstract themes, and they become more. Well, really educational, I would say. The John Deere, I mean, that's really a fantastic work on the history of American agriculture, or the mural at St. John's that will be discussed this afternoon also shows this where scholarship, sort of the sources of wisdom and scholarship and knowledge that the students are to draw from. Yeah, but I'm coming back to Giancarlo one more time. Because I really wanted to show this relation between the two. So Textiles and Objects, the store by Herman Miller, Amy already mentioned. As far as we can tell, Giancarlo, as early as 1958, he was creating ceramics that Alexander would then sell in the US. And here, as part of the Textiles and Objects store, quite a few more pieces came into the collection or were sold through Herman Miller to customers. And I really like these drawings here that Giancarlo sent to Alexander, in which he's showing exactly with his wonderful pencil drawings which ceramics he has created and what they cost and what they mean. And there's one where it says here, it's a man and a woman in a bed, and he's hoping it's not too shocking. Otherwise, he could put a cat on the bed to make it a bit less problematic. And so he's also speaking about costs and then the sizes. So it's a clear inventory of what his company of ceramics can offer. So my sense is that he started out as a commercial graphic artist, but then later, probably mid to late 50s, he's really turning his interest more to ceramics. And Laura's wonderful exhibition downstairs is showing this fantastic little village or castle-like structure that he created, and of which he created quite a few that his brother then helped to sell to the US. And whereas as a graphic designer, his work was featured as the work of Jings, his work as a ceramic artist is featured as the work of Toonsey, as you can see here. Below. So it's Toonsey ceramics, household ware, but also many of these figurines, and then also these kind of plates that you could put together as a kind of ceramic mural with different objects, and also kind of collector's items, of course. And here I see again a bit of a parallel to another great Italian designer, Piero Fornasetti, who's currently celebrated in a number of big exhibitions in Europe. He was also a painter and worked in many different disciplines, but it was really the generation of Giancarlo also. So yeah, I don't know if they ever met, but I think it's this sort of narrational quality of design, this storytelling that's involved here in Italian design in particular, that is important. In our archive, there's one folder, Giancarlo Gerard, in which I found this drawing here. This was a late exchange between the two brothers. In 1970, Giancarlo writes to Alexander to inform him, and they corresponded in English. I thought that was also interesting. He writes to him that he was commissioned to design the facade of a new 200-bed hotel in Castelnuovo that he's drawing up there. And above it, you can see that he was one of the many people in Alexander Gerard's network providing him with new pieces of folk art. So he spotted things during his travels in Europe and tells him, okay, I've seen this, I've seen this, I've seen this, what do you want? And the answer was probably everything. And so Giancarlo writes about this hotel project that they had before visited together. They'd been to Castelnuovo. So he says he provided for his client 5 scale drawings, and then he writes, quote, and I think you can see that there's also a sense of humor running in the family. And after wives, in-laws, daughters, and others examined and had their say, this is like a hospital. This is like a seminary, this is too rustic, this too Le Corbusier, this too Baroque, etc. The most complicated and fancy solution was immediately adopted, the one with most arches and balconies and frills. This will probably be the first Settecento building to be built since the Settecento in Italy, and the first non-contemporary, non-modern hotel to be built in Italy since at least 1930. So also there, I think they shared an interest and passion for the architecture of other times. Yeah, in closing, I'm coming back to Alexander Gerard, of course, with this textile design, Palio, which is one of the closest references to Italy in his textile designs, of course making reference to the Palio in Siena, using some of the flags or insignia of the contrades that are fighting in this fantastic horse race that has been in Siena since the Middle Ages and is happening there every summer. So some of these are very close to actual contrades colors, and others he has made up. And palio in Italian meaning cloth or cape, and also being the award then for the winner of that horse race. His last major textile work was after the environmental enrichment panels that he had created for Herm Miller in the early 70s. In 1976, he collaborated with the great weaver and designer Jacqueline Larson to create this Palazzo 76, in which he kind of revisited again the Italian cityscape. And of course, this is just an imagined Duomo. I think I see some connections there to the Duomo in Milano, maybe. And in this black and white, of course, also a reference to many of the Tuscan buildings executed in a darker and a lighter marble, hence, structuring the facade of the building. Already as a young student at the boarding school in Bedford, he had this keen sense for the wonderful public life in Italian towns on the Italian piazza. In 1924, so aged 16 or 17, he wrote an essay about life in Italy in contrast with that in England. And he wrote, "One of the most striking differences between English and Italian customs is that of keeping the Sunday according to the Roman Catholic Church. People crowd the streets on a Sunday, the cafes are open, and other shops like confectioners, bars, these are not the same as in England, Restaurants and even hairdressers are open on a Sunday. Everyone is dressed in his best, and all the farmers of the neighboring district collect in the large towns to have a pleasant time, usually going to church in the morning and going either to the cinema or some sort of amusement in the afternoon. It's not like in England, when on Sundays the streets are practically deserted. In Italy, everyone likes to enjoy himself laughing and talking along the streets. It was a good essay, said his teacher. So I'm hoping I was showing you a bit of these connections to Italy and the importance of Italy. But of course, I didn't mean this title, Renaissance Man, just as to speak about these inspirations, but also as a term of recognition, a term that was introduced in the English language in the early 20th century, and after the war really also became a term of recognition amongst designers, for designers who really have a large expertise in many different areas, and that really also work in many different disciplines, as Girard did. And it also refers to the fact that he was, throughout all his life, he kept being interested in these pre-modern, pre-industrial ways of living. And I think he was always, as a designer, one that was very interested in the crafts and in really doing things himself and not letting others execute it. And this was all sparked in Italy and then really expanded around the globe. Thank you.